So how this is going to go down. I've got a few questions for our panelists to get things going here, and then we'll open it up for conversation with us all. Jody will be popping around to get your questions, and I'm just going to set some ground rules here. One of them is, feel free to ask a specific question to one of our panelists here, and it's totally cool, you all, not to have to respond, each of you, to every question. Because otherwise, these are wonderful leaders, but we might only have time for 2 or 3 questions. I've done this before.
It was a gentle invitation.
Yeah, gentle invitation. Stop. Yeah. No. And feel free to, if there's something that's came up in a breakout session or something you've sort of been mulling over along the way, this would be a great opportunity to get that out for more of us. So I'm going to start just with a question to each of our panelists, and then I'll sort of go big picture. But to Jody, since we just started going, since we just learned from your great presentation, you mentioned to bringing up the opportunity for pastors and other church leaders to actually sit down with folks in their living room and invite them to increase a gift to the organization. I think that's a wonderful practice and invitation for us. It also might be a little bit scary, and especially for folks who we know have giving capacity, but if pastors haven't had that experience to actually talk to somebody that capacity is clear and ask for a gift. So since you do that sort of thing, since your team does that sort of thing, can you give us some tips or sort of ways to lower anxiety for that their very practical process of inviting a gift?
I think one of the things that is mostly in our way is the file in our heads about fundraising and all the things we've told ourselves all our lives. And how it's hard to ask for money, it's not nice to ask for money, it's pressuring to ask for money. And so I would suggest you befriend a fundraiser, get to know them and ask them about their work, and listen to them talk about how they love asking for money. Because what they're doing is asking people to match their values with how they use their money. I would find it totally terrifying to be with someone on their deathbed. But you do that. I would be scared to talk to someone who was worried about their marriage and what was going to happen next. And you do that. You do a lot scarier things than asking for money. But there's this thing in our heads about asking for money, and it's not true. The people who do ask for money see it as a vocation, as a priestly function. They love it. They get joy out of it. And so hang out with some folks like that until you get over the thing in your head. Ask some folks in your congregation. So I often go with fundraisers to talk to our donors, and the fundraiser asks for the money while I talk about the mission. Do that. Don't be the one to ask. And over time, if you think you can, it just seems to me to be another pastoral thing to say, thinking about how you use your money, how about more for the congregation? And maybe try to compare it to some of those other tough conversations you have. It's not much tougher than many of the other human conversations we have.
Yeah. Thanks. I think it's super helpful, and it just underlines the fact that it's not something that pastors and other stewardship leaders sort of have to do as an annoying part of their job. We're trying to live into the possibility that actually this is part and parcel of ministry. This is a deeply pastoral act. If money is sort of all about our relationship with money is all about what our faith is about, then actually this conversation around money is a beautiful, holy thing that is essential to our ministry together. So along those lines, Bruce mentioned in his presentation that as a mission developer, I speak in Lutheran, as a new church developer for Presbyterians, he preached about money a whole lot, even as his church was being formed. So for some of us in our established churches, that might seem a little strange, because many of us assume that since we don't talk about money, it would probably scare people away. So can you tell us, like, for real, you talked about money a lot as a new mission developer, and what did that look like, and what was your experience there?
Thanks. So it's interesting, great juxtaposition here. So I'm actually coaching 4 mission developers in Southern California as they're doing their church plants, their starts. And one of my biggest issues with them to help them think through that is one, generally church planters and mission developers don't think about organization until it's too late. And they don't think about money until there's a crisis. And so what I try to help folks think about is when you're asking out of crisis for a church plant or a new start, that's not very compelling. And so how do you build into just your DNA to have this idea to talk about money? And the piece that I encourage them to do is because not everybody can do everything. I think that's that when you're a solo pastor, you can't do everything, but to find the champion in their community who will make that ask for them. Like who's going to walk with them as they're doing this amazing church planting work, and who's the champion who's going to stand with them and be able to make those asks from the community, from their members, from all that. And so that begins to build the DNA that it's about, look at this amazing work we're doing, not, oh, you need to give so we survive and our doors are open. So I learned that early on from people who mentored me to do that early in the congregational life so that if there was crisis for whatever reason, the small church, we have to do this or this is going to happen, then it wouldn't feel like, oh, it's a jolt. It's like, yeah, this is just what we do as a community or family. There are times we put in more, there are times where, so that was the motivation behind it. So it would make my life easier in the long run if I talk about it now versus waiting until the stress and anxiety of it would probably make it so the folks wouldn't give. Yep.
Great, thanks. A pastor, a new church developer here in Minneapolis says when he surveys his congregation about sermon topics, that they would like him to preach on, money comes up as number 1 or 2 all the time. And he's like, I actually get sick and tired of preaching about it, but it's because that's what people are wrestling with in their lives. And so they want a relevant sermon about sort of the very, like what they're dealing with day to day. Which sort of leads us into my next question for Melissa this time. One of the challenges of your presentation was emphasizing the countercultural opportunity we have to embrace generosity and just to embrace the gospel, which I think is a really beautiful invitation, and it also is a little scary, So can you give us an image or sort of paint that picture of what are some congregations or organizations that you've seen that have embraced this call to countercultural living, and how does that relate to stewardship and fundraising?
Thanks. I think this is a real challenge, and I think that it is something that we have to choose again and again. For me, at heart, this is about coming to the conclusion that if I capitulate to the broad culture, I am agreeing that self-worth and net worth are equivalent. And actually, there's a expectation or a requirement of the gospel that we refuse that kind of a narrative. That in fact, we're in a different kind of economy. Well, what does it look like for a pastor? For a pastor, this means that we have to start with ourselves. As a leader, and I would say this as a lay leader, and I would say it for clergy as well, we often have personal work to do so that we can invite other people to that kind of reimagining of the way that we relate to money and stuff. That includes our income, the management of our resources, the way that we spend our resources. Giving is only a portion of that. So if we're not willing to examine our priorities in spending for our houses, for our educations, for our clothes and cars and all the material aspects of our lives, we won't be in a position authentically to talk to people about generosity because it becomes just another expectation. It remains a transactional part of our lives and something that feels like a consumer good. Now, there's a lot of evidence that people of faith do not regard their giving, particularly to their faith community, in the same way that they regard other kinds of philanthropic giving. That in fact it is something that is, so an economist would say it's more inelastic. People do not cut back their giving to their faith community when there's an economic downturn or when they're in their personal economic circumstances change. So what does it look like then if we're committed to leading in that way? I think that I appreciate Bruce saying this, and also your comment about getting tired of preaching about money because that is what people are anxious about or asking for. But it does mean talking about money beyond giving. If the only time we talk about giving or talk about money is when we're asking people to give, we're missing the opportunity to help people negotiate this important part of their lives. I have seen congregations that have really embraced this work open up a new space for considering what does vocation look like? How do I make sense of the place of work in my whole life? How do I make sense of the way that I relate to the people around me in service, in friendship, in community? That suddenly there are all of these other pieces of life that have an economic dimension that are touched by my faith formation, that discipleship calls me to consider differently. I do think that it is a mindset shift on the part of leadership that enables people to entertain a new way of relating to their money and their stuff.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, and I think actually, so that leads into another question. I'll open it up to anyone here. Because it's a through line for this whole conference. So early on we heard about the sociologists finding that pastors were often silent shepherds when it comes to money in congregations, and we were called to instead be story shepherds. And then Jody's presentation gave a really great example both of testimony of the mission of an organization in terms of a video, and she also shared her personal testimony of giving and how that changed her life and where that started. So where does this notion of testimony fit in the life of a congregation related to generosity? It can be, for a lot of mainline Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodists, the testimony word is pretty scary. But we've been called this few days to embrace it more, and I think it does have a powerful possibility for us. So can you make it less scary, or can you give some examples of what stewardship testimony might look like in the church today?
I think video has a lot to offer. Someone in a breakout said if the confirmation class ran around with their iPhones and asked people a question, people would answer it, or the youth group. And so just asking some people a simple question: why do you give? How do you give? How do you think about your giving? And shoot video instead of having someone have to come up front and speak.
Great, and it also gives it sort of just more of a way to normalize it. Like, this is just like an easy conversation. And if it's a horrible take, you don't have to show that clip on the video. Great. Other sort of possibilities for testimony?
So I've been in congregations that have a lot of different technological capacity, and I don't know where I shared, but the congregation I'm in now, 3 of my session, your councils don't even have email.
Okay.
And so we were thinking about how, and I love technology and we'll do all that kind of stuff, but the capacity isn't quite there. So I just changed the term from testimony to minute for mission. And right, I mean, because part of it is just the language and so we just, every month we have somebody, we choose an elder, they're in a transition time between pastors to talk about what drew them to the church and why they stay as they're thinking about growth in the future. And so we just called those minute for missions, and they come up and they tell their story, and I'm like, oh, those are testimonies, but whatever. So just kind of understanding your community and translating what you want to have happen into a space where they'll be able to hear it and understand it and participate in it. I think that's the crucial role for folks coming away from these kind of events, is how do you translate it to actually be useful there. And so I just changed language for this particular community. I've used videos in the past. We had the youth group actually go and do our stewardship one at the last church I was at that had all of this stuff. And that's really powerful because nobody says no to young people right now. So it's great.
The only thing I would add is that I think storytelling is incredibly powerful, but sometimes we feel anxiety that it has to be really well produced, and that vulnerability is too scary, too overwhelming. Seth Godin says, and I'm going to get this not quite right, but something to the effect of storytelling is most effective when you sound like a human being, when you talk like yourself. And I do think that there's a real power in modeling by leadership and then permission giving to tell the whole story. And I think that for many of us in leadership, that means practicing in the context of real relationship, talking about how we relate to money, how we think about philanthropy and giving, and inviting other people to have that conversation one-on-one in a small group setting before we're asking them to make a testimony that's intended to inspire giving, because we have to work through our experiences with these things.
That's great. I've heard of some congregations around stewardship season, but also just more broadly, because of the anxiety that sometimes comes when folks are asked to speak individually, of saying, well, what if we just have a conversation together? So put a pastor and a member up front. You still talk about giving or sharing one's stories about generosity or how the congregation's mission has affected that person, but more like this, sort of as a sort of looking into somebody's eyes instead of this sort of scary act of public speaking, a single person in front of a microphone. Speaking of speaking, as someone who gives talks, there's often something that I think right when I sit down, oh, I forgot to say that. So is there anything that you all have been like, oh my gosh, I wish I could have put into my presentation, or I wish I could have given a shout out to something that just didn't quite fit in? So if so, maybe this is just a personal thing. But if not, anything that sort of has been on your heart that you'd like to get out now?
I only not answer because there's a lot.
You have the slide?
I think so. Yeah, so Evan, can you get the slide up? If that'll work? Great.
I was telling Adam this morning about 3 books that are required reading by my senior leadership team. We're surrounded these days with all kinds of messaging and all kinds of noise in our world. And I think we need to feed our minds with possibility. And so these are 3 books that we've read at Lutheran Social Service that talk about how you can live in a world of lots of noise and still believe in possibility, and I offer them to you. I worry about all of this noise in our world, and then articles like we saw in the Star Tribune a couple weeks ago about declining attendance and membership in churches, and if you just keep feeding yourself that kind of information, how do you break through that? So offering these to you as ways to see what is also true in our world, and so that you can stand for possibility.
So, and Melissa and I were emailing this morning about a conversation got in a breakout group related to how do you start, if you haven't considered a money talk in your congregation much, how do you start a new conversation, or sort of what's a helpful entry point into that? So can you share your thoughts on that?
So I really do think that I'm really grateful to Jody for her talk this morning, because it is so very practical. And I think that sometimes there's such a reluctance to consider the kind of broad stewardship we do in a framework of best practice for fundraising. I'm on a one-person campaign to redeem the word fundraising for use in a religious context. Of course, Henry Nouwen backs me up on this, and so I feel pretty comfortable saying this is ministry. It is ministry work. And so the question came up in our conversation yesterday about, very practically, if we have a congregation that is very experienced in a scarcity approach, or what I would call a pay the bills mentality, I think the greatest tool that I would recommend for opening up a new conversation is actually a tool that belongs properly to the finance committee rather than to the fundraising committee, and that's use of a narrative budget to really talk about the kind of impact that takes place as a result of the financial investment of the people who are members, contributors to the congregation. There are wonderful resources. I will tell you that I think some of the very best come from the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. If you go to their website, you can easily find examples and frameworks for using a narrative budget model in the context of a congregational life. I also think that having that kind of presentation of the church's budget allows for, or holds some space open for conversations about the way that people think about their personal finances, their planning for the future. I actually think that there are areas of deep meaning in the lives of parishioners, members, that we hesitate to resource because we don't want to be presumptuous. I think finances, personal financial experience is one of those areas. I would also put it in a company with end of life, and of course there are important financial implications there. I'm always surprised at the way in which individual faithful members can give more to their congregation across their lifetime than to any other organization that they contribute to. And at the time of their death, their estate gifts are all directed somewhere else. And that's because, in general, we do not do a good job of inviting people to remember the church in their will. Introducing that conversation would be a great example of a resource that's provided to the people entrusted to our care that introduces a new conversation.
Great, thanks. And that, to change things a little bit, but the conversation that was going on Twitter with Bruce a little bit back and forth about the notion that in your talk you appreciated that sometimes the silence of congregations around money could actually be a factor of our own privilege to not have to talk about it. And then there's a little back and forth, well, you said could, but not necessarily and all that. So can you talk more about it? I was really curious about, and I think you're onto something about that, sort of where the privilege conversation comes into the congregational stewardship piece.
That was one of those, a couple days ago, I'm like, that's an interesting sentence. And threw it into my presentation. So I think conversations around privilege aren't just about race and economics and all that. So I think, for me, I was thinking about this idea that if you are never forced to talk about something, you never get into the practice of talking about it, and you also get to choose whether you do or not, right? So I do a lot of talks on race, and I'll go to communities that are often, my denomination, your denomination, are predominantly white. And these conversations are difficult, but the only way they get more undifficult is to have them, right? So, and you can choose not to. And so, kind of musing about this idea that as a family of color, in a multiracial relationship, all those kind of things, we talk about race all the time. And so we have this complex, nuanced understanding and broad spectrum of how we talk about race. So we're not just talking about this. It's the whole thing because it happens all the time in our life. So part of me wonders if we want to develop that same kind of broad understanding and nuanced ways of talking about the money part of our stewardship, then maybe we need to choose to talk about that more. And by not choosing to do that, there's some privilege that we're hiding under. And I think it's perceived privilege in some ways, because there was a day when we were, in our heads, we were this great monolithic entities, and that's just not who we are anymore, but we still live in that kind of world. So that, very early musing about that, but that's kind of where it came from.
Thanks. So I'm going to do one last question, and I'll pass things over to you all, and we can continue the conversation. The question's for Jody, and it's related sort of to this ecology. So one of the reasons I was really excited about Jody joining us is that one of the sort of wonderings I've always had is congregations, not only do we only talk about money when we need it, we tend not to talk about people's generosity beyond gifts to their congregation. And it seems like that we're missing a big part of the pie there, right? So if I'm giving to a nonprofit, often that's because of my religious convictions, but if my congregation doesn't actually ever acknowledge that, it seems like they're missing a part of sort of who I am as a person of faith. So have you seen, so as somebody who's both sort of in the faith world and in the nonprofit world, have you seen any practices in congregations or in nonprofits of trying to get past that bifurcation between, in church we can only talk about giving to church, and in the nonprofit world we only talk about giving to my single nonprofit?
Interesting. One of the congregations I dearly love is Nativity Lutheran here in Minneapolis. Anybody from Nativity? No? And they talk all the time about their mission here, near, and far. And so they talk about, obviously, their congregation, they talk about the neighborhood, they talk about LSS in the state and overseas. And so they have this sense that their mission is all of those things, and they bring in speakers about all of them, they get engaged as volunteers in all of them, they collect items for all of them, and they give financially as a congregation. I'm not sure whether they're asking individuals to think about all those things in their personal giving. I do remember the talk I went to on proportional giving was about how much do you make and how much do you give away, not how much do you give to your church. And I think that's the beautiful conversation to be had. And then after you've thought about that, then how much to the church. So I don't know that we have a lot of models of congregations speaking to giving outside the church right now. But I am thinking about how it kind of goes back and forth. When we do estate plan gifts, you should know that people say, good idea, we got to get this in order. Okay, I'll put my estate plan together. First I'm going to give to my church, and then I'm going to give, so you're benefiting from the work that we're doing. And that's fabulous. And but I'm not sure that I've seen really good models of church talking about giving away. And then here are the potential places. Mission of the month comes to mind, right? Where a church will embrace a different mission each month and bring people in from that organization to talk. And, so I am much more interested, though, in congregations thinking about how to do service with us. It's very clear to me that as we take care of the aging baby boom, we are not going to be able to buy services for our neighbors like we did for the last 20 years. The next 20 years, we're not going to be able to do that. So we're eager to get the congregations built into our business model of serving, especially seniors, but others in the community, because we won't be able to afford to do it with our tax dollars. And so I'd rather see the joint service than even the joint conversation about money.
Great. Well, and I think joint service might be a place to start. Yeah,
yes.
Great. And Bruce seems like...
real briefly, one of the things I didn't get to during the 18-minute one, but I did talk in the breakout, was so when you work in a young adulty kind of community, you get to do a lot of things that all of a sudden have become retro and cool, that many of us feel like, oh my God, they're really doing that. So we did pledges. I told the story, the church I'm at now does pledge envelopes. And we got ours, my wife and I got ours, and we're like, ugh. My kids are like, those are cool. We're like, no, they're not. They're not cool. In any case, so we did pledging at the new church plant, and we pledged time, talent, and treasure, and asked for 4 to 5 hours of giving of that time somewhere. And we tracked financial and time to the church and to other organizations to kind of value. If you give 2 hours over here, that's part of, like, it doesn't all have to come through us. So I think honoring that and being consistent with that starts to put people in people's heads throughout the year. I'm just giving part of my time and my talent to other places. So
yeah, that's beautiful, because that's a great example, because the danger of time, talent, treasure cards is that we only ever talk about the treasure or track the treasure. But y'all are actually saying, no, this is what you're about, and we're really curious about how you're serving or volunteering.
And we would publish, here's how many hours this community gives every month to outside organizations. And that was motivating for people.
Beautiful. Well, so let's open up to y'all. What are your questions? And if it's to a specific speaker, please name that, or if it's to the whole panel, name that. And Don will...
I have mic 7 for Evan.
And Evan, mic 7 is what Don has.
Raise your hand. Or
I do
stand
have
up.
some other questions. It's really...
I see Stacy over here. You're going to make me work for it today.
To Jody, as I'm in my first call, and as many know, that you don't, seminary doesn't do teaching well of administration. And you talked about going into the home and, stating what the giving has been and naming a number. A lot of times what I'm hearing is pastors shouldn't know what the giving is. I disagree with that because it indicates a lot of different things pastorally, but what are your thoughts?
I've never heard that. Other people have heard that.
Oh, yeah.
No.
This is
That was one of the questions I had for you.
This is great. Well, I will get some different perspectives. So let's start with Jody, and then I know Melissa is
Well, the CEO
ready
in
to go
a social
here.
ministry organization knows the dollar amount. That's for sure. And so I have been using a little bit while I've been here the difference between the spiritual relationship between a pastor and the flock, and the pastor as the head of an organization. And when we're asking for gifts for the congregation, we're running an organization and we're asking for the gifts it takes to run that organization. Then we also have the pastor as pastor to the flock. Wow, that talking about a person's money is not part of that conversation is surprising. It surprises me that pastors can talk to us about sin, but not money. So maybe that's the same kind of thing as we should separate church and politics, and I don't want to hear about politics from the pulpit. We hear that a lot. And of course Jesus was engaged in politics and Martin Luther was all over politics. And so maybe we should just say, I don't think so. I don't think it should be that way.
Yeah, so Melissa gets to work with a lot of pastors who are in contexts that either some of them have a tradition of pastors knowing what people give, and some of them that is absolutely a really scary thing and contrary to all practices. So yeah, what do you think, Melissa? Should pastors, or might it be a helpful practice for pastors to know the giving rates of their members of the congregation?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay.
So I'm really curious, and I wonder if by show of hands, how many of you in the congregation where you worship or where you serve, how does the pastor know who gives what? So this looks like maybe slightly less than half. That's just my assessment, but I am very clear. I have a stake in the ground around this in teaching and inviting growth and leadership around the financial stewardship of congregational life. I'm really grateful for Jody's expression of disbelief because I do think that this is it is shocking. There is no other kind of organization where we would encourage the senior executive not to know about the revenue to the organization. Now, there are a whole host of cultural factors that intersect. I do not think that it is usually wise for a pastor to come like a bull in a china shop, demanding a major cultural change where there's been a culture of secrecy. But there is a major difference between secrecy and confidentiality, and the responsibility of the senior leader to care for the financial well-being of the institution supersedes the anxieties that they bring, and it supersedes the anxieties of the people in the congregation. Especially because very often there is significant risk exposure in a congregation where a large proportion of the budget is being carried by a very small minority of donors. And if those donors are, for some reason, liable not to continue to give in the same way for the next 2 years or 3 years or 7 years, I mean, if they're very elderly, this is something that has real implications for the future health of the institution. And if no one is paying attention to that, it's a recipe for crisis. I also would say that regularly pastors say to me, I don't want to know because I'm afraid that I will not treat people the same. And I just think, get right with yourself. Because you trust yourself with all kinds of more sensitive information about people's lives than who's giving what to the congregation.
Say, Adam.
Yep. So Jody will find another question while Jody responds. Oh, sorry, Don. Yeah, great.
Now that I've collected my thoughts, I could see that being a conversation stopper. If you're sitting and talking with someone and they say, well, I don't think, really? Why do you think that? Let's talk about that. And start another conversation about that. And don't get stopped by that. It's just the thing that I would suggest.
That's great. And it's also always an opportunity. You can't thank people if you don't know who's giving, right? So that can also sort of lead into that conversation.
We've got
Don.
one here.
Thanks, Don.
Okay. Just one point of information, then a question. In the ELCA, the pastor is not the senior executive officer constitutionally. My question is, I've heard a lot about relationships and the importance of developing these relationships, getting to know what motivates them to give. Where do you exactly fit that into your time? I mean, I already have 2 or 3 evenings tied up with meetings. I preach twice a week. We have confirmation, lots of preps, 3 worship preps. Where do you carve this time out? Does it come from keeping me another night away from my family? Don't I mow the lawn in my neighborhood? I mean...
Melissa, great.
So I would say that it does require a shift from thinking about this as an additional administrative responsibility to understanding it as part of pastoral care. Now that can feel like a pretty dramatic shift, but fundraising at bottom is not about money, it is about relationships. And I know that pastoral leaders are exceptionally gifted at relationship work. So I think that it can be freeing to take a look at much of the relationship work and the pastoral care work that takes place in the context of the congregation as including the development of relationships for effective financial stewardship.
Can I just suggest a tool that we borrowed from Luther Seminary a few years ago? I don't know if you know about this. It was one where the foundation board was interviewing people, donors, about their values and their money and how do they think about that. And so we sent our foundation board members out to talk to some of our key donors, many of whom, when we paired them up, didn't know each other. Sometimes we paired people who did know each other. And they would sit and have this conversation, and all we wanted them to do was go down this questionnaire and ask these questions and write down the answer. They didn't have to figure out what to say or what do I say now or how do I handle that. Just fill out this thing. And these were rich, lovely conversations. So if there's any way to send a stewardship committee out, for example, with a tool like that, to have some of these kinds of conversations, that may be one way to get it done.
Yeah, there's a fascinating paradox around conversations about money is we tend not to have them, but once they start, people really find joy in finally having the opportunity to talk about it. So great. Another question, Don. Great.
Thank you. I serve a congregation that is aging, many of whom are on fixed incomes, and I wonder if there's anything particular that any of you have to offer that is sensitive to that situation and how to break open the fear around there's only this and I need it for that. Thanks.
So I'll go again. I've served a congregation that's older in experience and age and all those kind of things. And as the interim came in and really listened to what the stories were around why the budget was not as healthy, was in the red for 15 years in a row, what was going on, and began to hear some of the reasons why people weren't giving to the capacity they even felt they could. And some of it was the commodification of church life, like I'm going to give if I'm happy, I'm not going to give if I'm not, and naming some of those things, and really challenging and pushing a little bit. The joy of being an interim is your job is to push on a few things and the right things, not on everything. And that was been a really important one to do, to find some and love them through that moment where we were in the black $75 right now year to date, which they must have thought they were like, they're just like, oh my gosh, we're in black $75, right? But it was great because they had this moment of we are a generous place, and we just needed to listen the right way to discover those points where that generosity could be shown, but also challenging some of the notions and where the anxiety is coming from isn't always the place that we may think they're coming from. So again, I'm a working class, blue collar kind of community, and really understanding that piece was crucial to knowing that. So finding out what those stories are, because some people they can't, and that's fine, and they'll give what they can. But others, I think there's things that are holding them back that we just haven't given permission to release yet. And so that our gift of being with them is to find those things out.
Beautiful, thanks. I think we have time for 2 more questions. I'll get 1 more question. I've been instructed. So Dawn will pick the last question here. Great. And while she's walking, I'll say, just give as you're leaving. Well, actually, I won't say that because I don't know if the postcards are still out there. I know though that Luther Seminary's stewardship newsletter is sent out every week, and you can sign up for that at luthersem.edu/stewardship. Chick Lane has a beautiful post in there that talks about this notion of fixed income. And he says, actually, when you think about it, we all have a fixed income. And part of it's the language we use. So if we have opportunities to open up conversations, we might discover different formulations. So last question. Here we go. Great.
My name's Del McCormick. I'm senior pastor of Rincon UCC in Tucson. So last year we did an intervention on 4 or 5 people who had a very unhealthy dynamic in the church of controlling the money and running people out of the church, and particularly women anyway. The result of that dynamic was that they were sidelined and that the stewardship and finance ministry team was reconfigured and they weren't on it. All of them reduced their pledges to like $500, and all of them were over $10,000. And we knew that could happen. We knew that that's a way of using power and having vengeance and so forth, but it resulted in $29,000 less in pledges this year. We have a healthy budget. We meet our budget every year. But what do you recommend about talking to the congregation about that practice, or going to visit those people and talking about that, because all but one of them are still in the church? So it's kind of a secret. You know, the congregation knew that we came up $20,000 short on our pledge goal, but we had a $21,000 excess from last year, so we were very fortunate, but we'll face that again in the coming year. Thank you.
Thanks. So, yeah, I'm looking at Melissa, but I'll just say, to give her a moment to think, my go-to word whenever there's a question about budgets is transparency. That long-term, being transparent is a healthier way. And it's a practice that overall piece to generosity. That's not to say that in the short term it can be really difficult, but that's just my quick response. Melissa?
I would just commend you because I think that having a healthy governance structure is in fact long-term much more important to the congregation than feeling that the ability to cultivate generosity in the community is held hostage to that kind of expectation. Now, I would encourage pastoral conversation with members of the congregation who make any kind of very substantial change in their giving. So this is also a reason for pastors to have regular updates. Maybe they aren't looking themselves at giving, but when there is a change in an individual's giving to the congregation, it is often the first indication that something significant's happened in their life. And so this is a particular circumstance, but I would encourage the conversation. Now that's pastoral work. It's not going to be easy. And I'm in agreement with Adam that having transparency about the finances of the congregation invites other people to think intentionally about how they're participating in the life of the congregation through their financial giving. I think that many people give without much consideration. So I always am interested when I see the gifts to a congregation, and I see a lot of gifts for $1,200. And it's because people have a habit of giving $100 a month. And so if they have never been invited to a conversation that's reflective about proportional giving or just about discipleship and stewardship, they might well be in a position to really consider whether they can grow in their giving to the congregation as well. I just think that it is important to have confidence that transparency and good governance will in fact lead to greater sustainability and health in the finances of the church in the long term, even though that change can be really painful.
Wonderful. Let's thank all our panelists this morning for sharing their wisdom.